Ever wonder why the world's biggest superpowers are suddenly shifting their strategic gaze? And we're talking billions of dollars in investments here, to the African continent? If you've been glancing at global headlines lately, you know the geopolitical center of gravity is moving, and it is moving fast. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and highly complex geopolitical rivalry that's unfolding right under our noses. The tale of two strategies in Africa, spearheaded by India and China. We're going to look strictly at the data, the history, and the policies to see exactly how these two Asian giants are taking remarkably different approaches to a continent that is just absolutely brimming with potential. To understand why all this is happening right now, you really just need to look at one staggering number: 72%. Over the last 10 years, 34 African countries, which by the way are home to 72% of the continent's citizens, have seen measurable, real improvements in governance performance. We are talking major strides in civic participation, the rule of law, and human rights. It's a monumental shift, and it's exactly what's drawing all this global attention.
Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start off with the macro drivers in the African Renaissance. Then we'll examine China's dragon's footprint, followed by India's elephant stride. After that, we'll look at some of the execution stumbling blocks, and finally, map out the path forward.
So, Section 1, the African Renaissance, a continent of potential. Before we can really understand the foreign policies of India and China, we've got to grasp the immense internal shifts that are making Africa such a global focal point to begin with.
There are a few core forces driving this attention. Naturally, there's a vast wealth of natural resources. But honestly, more importantly, there's the human capital. We're talking about a booming youth population that is completely ready to reshape the global workforce. Diplomatically speaking, Africa's 55 nations hold immense weight in the UN. And economically, the projections are incredible. Countries like Ethiopia are projected to almost completely eliminate extreme poverty by the year 2050. That is huge. However, modern African nations are choosing their global partners very, very carefully these days, and for good reason. The continent is still dealing with the very real scars of colonial exploitation and some poorly conceived transfers of power. They're also having to navigate what economists call the resource curse. It's this frustrating phenomenon where abundant natural resources sometimes end up fueling corruption instead of widespread development. So, as global powers come knocking today, African leaders are keenly aware of these historical pitfalls. Which brings us to Section 2, the dragon's footprint in China's security shift. Now, China has been a heavy investor in African infrastructure for quite a while, but their strategy has recently undergone a pretty distinct evolution. Now, what's really interesting about this geography is the maritime positioning. The strategic Horn of Africa is absolutely vital for China to achieve its Vision 2035 trade objectives. It's essentially the ultimate gateway, and China has placed a massive strategic emphasis right there. Let's break down how this triggered China's broader policy shift. For decades, Step 1 was pretty straightforward: strict non-interference and pure infrastructure investment. But then Step 2 completely changed the game. Local conflicts, like the one in Ethiopia's Tigray region, started directly threatening Chinese assets. Because of that, Step 3 became a total necessity, a major shift away from that non-interference policy toward active security involvement to protect those investments. And the thing is, they're pairing this new security approach with modern diplomacy. A really prime example of this? 500,000. That's the number of vaccines, 5 lakh doses, that China donated to the Horn of Africa region. It's pretty much a masterclass in blending financial, security, and diplomatic aid all at once. All right, let's look at the contrast in Section 3, the elephant's stride, focusing on India's historical approach. While China has definitely led with heavy infrastructure and security, India's engagement is deeply rooted in a shared history. You see, India's engagement actually dates all the way back to the 1950s. Grounded heavily in anti-colonial solidarity, they stepped up early on with technical assistance for newly independent nations. Fast forward a bit to 2008, and we see this relationship formally institutionalized with the first India-Africa Forum Summit. By 2015, the third summit made this platform the absolute central pillar of their strategic partnership. To really codify this modern relationship, India outlined 10 guiding principles. The core focus here is highly collaborative. They're focusing on relying on African talent for capacity building, keeping markets open, and sharing India's own digital revolution experience to help improve public services. Oh, and of course, teaming up on climate change cooperation. And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic divergence between the two nations. When you put them side by side based on the source data, China relies heavily on state-led infrastructure, active security, and big resource deals. India, on the other hand, is leaning into its strengths in capacity building, human capital development, and digital technology. So it's essentially a hard power, resource-driven focus going up against a soft power, talent-driven priority.
But, as we all know, having a grand philosophy is one thing, executing it is another entirely. That brings us to Section 4, Stumbling Blocks. We have to objectively look at the internal execution issues that are hindering India in this highly competitive space.
The data actually reveals a cascading series of problems here. First off, there is often a lack of a clear, cohesive development strategy, meaning India isn't always targeting specific goals like food security. And that leads right into the next issue, unlinked lines of credit, where grants sort of just operate in isolation. Ultimately, this poor synchronization leads to poor dispersal rates and a pretty frustrating track record of stalled projects. Beyond just the execution side of things, there are some pretty deep economic hurdles too. For instance, India's trade is overly localized to East Africa, and it's heavily reliant on petroleum. Then, right around 2016 and 17, a sharp 21% global drop in foreign direct investment to Africa really spooked Indian investors. Add in a domestic slowdown in the Indian telecom sector, and while it becomes pretty clear why Indian companies are struggling to compete with China's massive state-backed funding. Now, you might have heard of the AAGC, that's the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. This is a joint initiative launched by India and Japan. But despite both of those countries having a long, rich history in Africa, it simply hasn't been effectively implemented yet. At this point, it's honestly a bit of a stretch to view the AAGC as a true counterweight to China's massive Belt and Road Initiative. Which leaves us asking, what's next? Moving on to Section 5, the path forward. Given the reality that India simply cannot match the massive financial war chests of China or Western nations, how exactly do they course correct?
So the crucial point here is focus. India needs a hyper-focused strategy. The primary target, human capital. Africa has a massive youth population that is desperate for skills and job creation. By focusing their limited resources there and really partnering with NGOs for low-cost, high-impact development, India can create immense mutual benefit without trying to match China dollar for dollar. And critically, they absolutely must figure out a way to expedite those stalled projects.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen China's pivot from non-interference to active security and massive infrastructure. We've seen India's deep, historical roots of anti-colonial solidarity and its modern struggles with execution. The stage is set, the resources are vast, and the geopolitical implications are, frankly, enormous. So can India effectively leverage its historical ties and pivot to a hyper-focused human capital strategy to secure its future in an increasingly competitive Africa? It's a complex rivalry that will absolutely shape the global economy for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.